Welcome everyone to the Portland Urban Wineries webinar for Oregon Wine Month. We're going to get things kicked off in just a couple of minutes. Let a few more people join. And I'll let our trade education manager, David DeWitt, give us an overview of what's coming up for Oregon Wine Month.
Thanks, Bree, and welcome everybody as the room starts to fill up. It's great to see some names from previous seminars showing up, and we love it when you call out your destination. So hello to the individual in Peru. Thank you for joining us.
That's awesome.
Last week we had New Zealand and some other spots globally. So it's really great to see attendees from all over the world. We're excited to have our third installment of Oregon Wine Month educational webinars. Today we'll be focusing on Portland and the urban wineries that we get to enjoy right here in the city center of Portland, Oregon. Again, I am David DeWitt. I manage trade for the Oregon Wine Board, and Oregon Wine Month is right around the corner. So I'm going to drop in the chat right now for everybody the link to our toolkit. So if you're still in the process of planning your promotions, there is educational information in there. There's digital assets for promotion through e-commerce, social media, what have you. We invite you to take a look and hopefully you can find some good stuff in there. If not, feel free to reach out and contact myself or Bree, and we're happy to do what we can for you to promote Oregon wines in the month of May. We'll share our emails towards the end of the presentation. But again, thank you everybody for carving out time in your day. And we're excited to have another great panel to discuss the urban landscape and the wines that are made here right in Portland, Oregon. Of course, we encourage everybody to feed the chat or the Q&A with questions, and we'll do our best to reply to them as they come up. And again, the recordings will be made available, or the webinar recording will be made available afterwards. So if you want to revisit or share it, it's there for you. And hello from Arizona. Everybody should be on mute, and I think you've been through a couple of these before. Bree, I probably will hand it off to you. Bree is our Director of Education. She's a Master of Wine, and she's assembled the panel today, and she will be introducing our guest. And thank you, guests, for joining us.
Thanks, David. Happy to be back for another Wine Month webinar session. And this one is a view from Portland downtown and its urban winemaking scene. We are fortunate, and that's the beautiful city of Portland. We are fortunate to have with us some of our urban winemaking scene most active and some of the oldest, not by age, but by establishment wineries on this webinar today. So let's jump right into introducing them. We have the lovely Anne Hubatch from Helioterra Wines. She has a fantastic winery in downtown Portland and also a cidery. So that's one thing that you're going to discover in this webinar, is that those who are in the downtown can't help but dabble and explore all the world of fermented beverages. So we're super excited to have her and share her insights about being in this region and one of the first urban wineries in downtown Portland. We also have Alex Morrow from Archival Spirits and Ash Street Wines. Alex has been a long-term restaurateur here in Portland who got bitten by the bug, as many of us who started in restaurants do, and has moved across to making some of the most exciting vermouths and reviving archival spirits here in Portland. So excited to chat to him today as well. Unfortunately, Pam from Willful Wine can't join us today. She's having a puppy emergency, which I completely understand. But we also have Julia Burke from Willamette Valley Wineries on the line as well, who can answer any Willamette Valley specific questions that you may have. And she's also a master at dropping in links and giving you all the information that you could ever think about close at hand. And there she goes right there. Thanks, Julia. So I wanted to touch very quickly on just the amount of wine regions that Oregon touches on. And this is really important for the urban wine scene because all of these wine regions are actually available for tasting in the urban wine scene. The Oregon wine scene is really increasing quite dramatically. We have nearly 400 vineyards and around 1,000 wineries now in Oregon and Portland. And I'm going to let you jump in and tell us a little bit about all of the regions that the urban wine scene focuses on or doesn't focus on for that matter. And especially since, you know, the Willamette Valley is actually nestled around the downtown core of Portland. So one of the few urban wine scenes that is actually situated within a nested AVA. So Anne, can you just touch on not only the AVAs that you source from within the Willamette Valley or that the producers in Portland source from, but all around the state as well? And you're on mute.
There we go. Sorry about that. Hey, everybody. I am Anne Hubatch from Helioterra Wines. I'm located in inner Southeast Portland, and I'm kicking it right off with my notes here. Thanks, Bree, for one that I can read off. So it's actually pretty incredible. We did a survey a couple of months ago across all 13 of us in the Portland Urban Winery Association, which, to be fair, is 13 of the 24 wineries that exist within the city. There are some that are just starting who maybe haven't grown to a point that they've joined yet, and others that, maybe aren't necessarily on the team player status, which is fine. Everyone has their own thing. But just amongst the 13 wineries that are members of the Portland Urban Winery Association, looking down my list here, I see 19 different AVAs that we source grapes from. So that's across Oregon and Washington. So not just specifically the Willamette Valley and the nested AVAs, but actually as I'm looking here, everything that is up on your screen right now is represented by wineries in Portland, plus a number of others down in Southern Oregon and across Washington. So it's really quite exciting how much diversity you have within the wines produced in the urban center. None of us actually own our own vineyards. We rely 100% on our growers, our growers in order to be producers, because we tend to focus just on the winemaking, focus on the areas where we believe we do best, and hire the best growers out there to bring in fruit to make our wines in our urban wineries. So it is pretty remarkable how much of the Northwest you could taste if you were to visit a handful of the Oregon or the Portland urban wineries just in one afternoon or a weekend.
Yeah, and that's pretty unique. When you think about coming wine tasting, you think about, often, making the trek out to the valley, which is, 45 minutes at least from Portland. But it's quite possible for you to be able to fly into Portland in an afternoon or just for a weekend and taste a significant amount of what the state has to offer, and even what Washington has to offer right from Portland. So that's pretty exciting and really a fun and accessible way to get into, wine tasting in Oregon.
Yeah, I'm also, to that end, as far as varietals that we work with, because you're pulling from so many different AVAs, there's over 24 different grape varieties made within the city limits of Portland that we know of right now. At last I heard we grow over 70 different grapes within the state of Oregon. So for about a third of that to be represented within the city limits is pretty phenomenal.
Yeah, and that's growing all the time as more varieties become available and farmers and growers continue to experiment with what can be grown around the state here, and even when it's by accident. So, there's a lot of variety that's actually starting to come out, and not only variety of grape varieties, but varieties of styles of wine as well. we'll jump into that a little bit later with Alex. And while we, oops, I don't know what I just did there. And while we have you, knowing that you're the oldest established winery, or second oldest established winery, right in the Portland city limits, can you walk us through a little bit of the history of the urban landscape here?
Sure, like where we've been and where we're coming. So I'll be honest, my history is a little bit more new world instead of old world. So some of this stuff that you're pointing to right now on the screen, I just learned actually when we started researching this or talking about putting this talk together. So up until 2 weeks ago, I hadn't heard about Adams Winery. So I got to learn something about the urban wine scene in just doing this particular talk. But it is no surprise that this area of Portland is home to a lot of wineries, specifically the inner Southeast, that first picture. So specifically like where my winery is located is also on the cusp of what we call Produce Row, which historically in the early days of Portland was when a lot of the farmers, the Italians and the Germans who were growing orchards and other crops on the banks of the Willamette River would bring them down to the river and put their crops out onto, you know, the shore of the bank of the river and sell their produce that way. So there were boats that would come up and people would buy the produce. So it really is not that stretch from a historical standpoint to go from farmers and folks in ag who were growing and producing and selling produce right here on the banks of the Willamette to now having a winery. I'm 7 blocks away from the bank of the Willamette River, and that is about as close as you could be to that historical data point. So that's pretty cool. Adams Winery, I'll be honest, I need to learn more about them myself, but they were here first. They no longer exist. And then jumping a couple of years, 15 years or so after that, Lori and Renee of Hip Chicks, they started their winery in 1999. So they are the oldest operating winery in Portland. They were kind of the Lone Ranger for quite a long time until around 2008 and 2009, when a few of us started coming into that scene. So for my own story, I started in at the same time that a couple others jumped in. So my friend John Groschow of GC Cellars had opened up a shared winery with what is currently Bodecker Cellars, but it was shared between Bodecker and Groschow at that time. Myself and Vincent Fritchie of Vincent Wine Company both shared a little bit of space in John's winery. So there you went, just in our building alone in 2009, you went from Renee and Lori having their lone outpost of urban wine in 1999 to 2009, and we just like over quadrupled it. So you added Groschow, Vincent, Helioterra, Bodecker, and at the same time, Enso Winery and a couple of others were also joining the scene. So all of a sudden, you know, the island of Hip Chicks Do Wine became more of a community. And so at that point in 2010, around there, we started the Portland Urban Winery Association and kind of really started to bind together as far as promoting this as a sub region or a region to come and visit as far as tourism within the Oregon wine scene. And like you said earlier, Bree, the fact that we were creating something here in the city that was emblematic of what was happening out in the valley, but giving tasters, consumers for the first time an opportunity to get off the plane and come right to a winery instead of driving and spending a whole day to get out to the valley. So that's something that's pretty unique. And yeah, we've been doing it for, well, since the association's been around almost 15 years now. So
great. Do you have any insight into, you know, what maybe prompted that movement in, you know, 2008 to, you know, suddenly have all of these, you know, wineries starting to look and making wine? Was it just opportunity? Were you working together to, you know, to move into that place specifically? Because, you know, I think you started out in the valley, didn't you, making wine? And I think Pam.
Yeah, I worked for other wineries for about 8 years before launching Helioterra. And actually, I know that a couple of us were all part of this little group that I started that was back in around 2008, which was kind of a winemaker support group, because there were a bunch of us that were like assistant winemakers or winemakers at other wineries, that we were all either had just started the initial stages of starting a brand, or were inspired to start a brand, or were on that like path. And I knew that I knew how to make wine. I knew that I had made plenty of 90-point plus wines. I didn't know the first thing though about starting a winery, starting a brand. Where do you get glass? Who do you design a label? What licensing do you need? And so there was probably between 6 and 10 of us that would meet up quarterly and have wine, surprise, and talk about those things. And through that, a couple of us, John, Vincent, myself, decided, hey, maybe sharing some space. John had already committed to a building, and then he was like, well, if you guys want to come on board, help me pay a little of the rent and see how that goes. So for like at least that little cluster of us, I think it was that, and other people kind of spurred off from there as well. As far as the timing of that, I don't know, it seems like dumb timing. It was a recession. It was like, why start a business at that same time? And I myself was silly enough to also birth my second child in the same year as starting my winery. So that was also a brilliant idea. So, it was one of those things that, I don't know, kismet. It was just kind of a relational thing that a lot of us dove in at that time. I think maybe, there's, I think, a couple different waves of winemakers. There's like the early stages, the founders, the David Adelsheims and the David Letts and those guys. And then there's the next wave, sort of like the Lynn Penner Ashes of the world that, had a lot of experience and started their brands. I like to think that I and a couple of other urban wine people are in kind of maybe that third wave, that we worked for a lot of these, either the founders or the secondary wave. I worked for Adelsheim for a while. I worked for Joe Dobbs for a while. And then we were inspired to start our own thing. So as far as like the generational turn of the Oregon wine scene, maybe it was just that it was time for a lot of us to then spread our wings after we had a few years experience working for these other wineries.
If I was to build off that though, I think there's a bigger context piece in there too, that I think it's interesting. Like Hipchicks, for anyone who's familiar with the city of Portland, like Hipchicks is located, they're like 2 doors down basically from the original Hair of the Dog brewery in Portland. And I do think that interim period between like 1999 and 2000, the late 2000s, there's like a huge amount of like, there's this like explosion and percolation of craft breweries, craft distilleries, and they all happen in the same area, like the Portland Distillery Row. It emerges in the late 90s, early 2000s in basically between Anne's winery and my winery, or around the corner from Hipchicks. And I think that there's a bigger context in there about what happened to Portland in that time period, where there's just a lot of bubbling interest in craft beverage, which spills out into winemaking and creates all this interest around it.
Yeah, and making it so accessible into an urban landscape as well, whereas, maybe before wine is not seen as much in front of, those in Portland, or seen as being part of, that urban landscape so much. You really had to make an effort to go out to wine country. And so, yeah, having that explosion of craft makers of everything is sort of, exciting in an urban landscape as well, and really starts to share a new product with people.
Well, like Anne says, I think that there's a sort of like collective knowledge that it requires in the urban landscape. Like, how do you move glass around in the city between, from place to place, and fitting into the odd places and retrofitting buildings. And I don't know, my own experience, I benefited greatly from like colleagues who helped me sort of navigate the city urban planning, because you go into the urban planning office and they're like, you want to start a what? Like, you can't put a winery in a downtown. That belongs like out in wine country, right?
Yeah.
And as long as you figure out how to navigate those things, but it requires like having the collective wisdom of a bunch of colleagues.
Yeah, I was even just thinking, where do you put all the grape must after you pressed it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting set of questions.
There are a couple of wineries that started, actually, they joke that it's like their 2-car winery, that they converted their home garages into that, and then used their city compost program, because we do have that here in Portland, where there's a city compost program where they pick up green waste at your house every week. And there were some wineries that literally started just in their garage, that they got it licensed and bonded, and used the resources within the city limits to start a small amount of commercial wine.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I've just got a couple of these shots here that were, sent over from people with their, the inside of a look at an urban winery, which doesn't really look that different to the inside of a regular winery, except that it just seems like the footprint is a lot more condensed.
Yeah.
Fewer tractors.
Fewer tractors, yeah. You need those really small forklifts so you can get around in there.
You also really can't do anything outside. That's that in contrast. So everything has to be inside, because there is a lot more crime, and you don't have a crush pad that would violate city codes outdoors.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, and also for that reason, does the urban wine scene or urban winery scene remain, fairly small? Is that what's the average, case production of an urban winery?
That's a really good question. I think there are a fair amount of smaller producers, but I think there's a handful of folks. Well, okay, let me say this. No, there is no one that is a large producer, right? There is no one in the urban center that would be considered a large producer. There are a lot of people that are small producers, and a handful that are probably medium-ish. But, in context, 75% of Oregon wineries are 5,000 cases or less, right? So when you take that into account, if you consider 5,000 average, sure, there's a bunch of us that are making that quantity of wine. More than that, there's only going to be a handful of those within the urban core that do that.
Yeah, absolutely. One other question, accessibility. I was thinking back to what you were talking about, with the timing and saying it was kind of crazy timing, right, for the wineries to be starting up in, at basically the Great Recession. But is there a really, is it an actual conversation that there is more, it's more accessible to start something up in an urban setting, or you don't have to buy a vineyard, you don't have, it's not a big land investment, and maybe there's less, agricultural sort of structures around an urban setting?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say that there is a lot of collaboration that happens within the city. And I think also most of us, because we're not tied to an estate vineyard, are also thereby not as tied to an estate winery. So perhaps that spurs more of a sharing mentality, that people are more open to share equipment, or, you have Matt in the picture there on the Clark forklift. For a while, I didn't have a press, and I actually, for one vintage, brought a bunch of my wine over to his winery and pressed it there, and then just trucked it as juice back to my winery. So like that sort of sharing, both within a building but also across town, those things I think are definitely much more accessible. I think the Oregon wine industry in general has a deep entrepreneurial spirit, but also the fact that Oregon in general still hasn't reached, not yet, a cost ceiling that it makes it too expensive for an average person to get into this industry. There's a lot of people who can scrap this by on, little extra savings or their salary, over their day job, and still have a day job and make wine. And I don't think that that's necessarily the case if you're talking about other, real expensive, fancy, well-regarded AVAs. Not to say that Willamette Valley isn't that well-regarded AVA, but the cost of entry in Napa is significantly more expensive than the cost of entry in the Willamette Valley.
But I think also, like, on that accessibility question, like, I think that like the fact of the matter is that like most of the majority of winemakers in Oregon or anywhere for that matter don't own estates, right? Like they don't own the vineyards that they get grapes from. They work with producers and they work with growers. And I think that's true of all of us in Portland that are making wine. Like we just pick and choose the growers that we work with. In some cases, those growers might be in the Columbia Valley. In some cases, those might be from the Willamette Valley or down in Southern Oregon. I don't think it's really much different. I think that actually Anne's point about this photo of Matt Burson at Portland Wine Company is an interesting one, because I know Matt used to make wine for a while. He made wine out in McMinnville, like in sort of the heart of Oregon wine country, but he lives in Southeast Portland. And I think he just got tired of driving out to McMinnville to make wine and figured out like, oh, I can actually do this in the city. And I know Pam at Willful Wines is the same way. It's like, well, why am I keep driving out to McMinnville every day to go make wine out there when I could just haul the grapes into the city and I can make the same quality of wine, if not better, in the city as I was in the valley and just not travel nearly as long. I could spend more time focusing on winemaking and less time focusing on driving, right?
Yeah, especially if you're purchasing all your fruit anyway, then, let the growers do, their craft and, you trust them and they understand your style and you're still visiting the vineyard. But yeah, having to do a 45-minute hour-long commute back to the city after doing a 12-hour day or, for 7 days a week for 6 weeks, that's a grind. So yeah, I completely understand that.
Well, I know Pam, we were sitting down talking about this subject in a sort of other session. And I remember Pam saying that like there were certain kinds of wine that she just didn't want to make because she didn't want to go out to the valley to stir her Chardonnay multiple times a week. And so she just didn't make Chardonnay. And it wasn't until she moved into the city that she was actually able to sort of start making some of the varietals that she wanted to, because she was closer to it and could go check on it more regularly. I mean, there are a number, like we lose a lot in the city in terms of like traditional pastoral aesthetics of wineries, right? You can't sit out on the deck and look over the vineyards, but you do, we can make amazing wine in the city. It doesn't hinder our abilities. And arguably we can maybe make as good or better wine because we have like this close network of people. We can borrow equipment from each other. We can collaborate in the same building. I mean, I know that at Portland Wine Company, there's multiple people. There's at least 2 people working in that 2 wineries in that same building. And I know Anne's got this really awesome project going on right now.
Yeah. And do you want to tell us a little bit about your project?
Well, thanks for that easy softball there, Alex. Yeah, I think to that point, there are a lot of us that share space. I started out in a shared winery. Actually, my entire history of making Helioterra has been in a shared winery space. And there's a lot about that environment that I really like and appreciate. And, specifically being able to just share conversation and community with people within your building and bounce ideas off of people and taste different wines and see what you think. And so building from that, when I leased my winery in 2018, had a few friends also in my building, but then fast forward to this past vintage, and organically every single tenant in my building was a female. And I thought, this is really cool. This is unique because women are not predominant within the wine world and within this industry. It is definitely still a male dominated field. So to have not only, a handful of women winemakers, but have an entire building full of them, I thought, hey, this is something that I think is probably pretty special, and reached out to a few different, Oregon Wine Growers Association, Willamette Valley Wines, the research librarian at the Multnomah County Library, and then also finally reached out to the wine writer here at the Oregonian and said, hey, I think I'm onto something. I don't think anyone else is doing this. I don't think there's another collaborative space that's all women. And I was right. We're the only all women cooperative space, not only in the country, but there's only one other one loosely doing the same thing in Australia. So to only have 2 all women production facilities in the world is both sad but also exciting, and an opportunity to keep growing from there. So yeah, we've renamed the production space the PDX Urban Wine Revolution, and are looking forward to building on that and building more, incubating more women winemakers into the Oregon wine industry.
Fantastic. And Alex, you came from the restaurant side, from the chef side. We hear about a lot of sommeliers coming into the wine making scene, but we don't often hear about a lot of chefs crossing over. Is that something that's more common in the Portland urban landscape because of you're surrounded by so many fantastic restaurants, and I imagine the chef community has the same type of deep community conversations and crossover that the winemakers do. How did you get into coming over to this side?
I mean, I don't know, relatively speaking, it's commonality, but I do know that in Portland, a number of us come out of the service industry and the restaurant world. I mean, my own background is like, I worked around restaurants in Portland for a number of years, and I worked at the Heathman Hotel in the late 90s. And I got the opportunity to go over and work in France and Italy. And so I traveled around in France, and I was living in the Piedmont for a while, working in a hotel restaurant, and I got totally turned on to digestif wines and amaros and aperitif wines. These are things that I just had no idea even existed, and became completely in love with them, but couldn't really figure out how to make them. And so I came back to the United States, and there wasn't really things available like it, and so I started fooling around, messing around with different ideas and sort of experimenting, bouncing ideas off of people that I know. I mean, this is one advantage of working in Portland, is that the culinary scene is big for a city its size, right? Is pretty robust and well developed. I think that's probably fairly well known across the sort of culinary world in the United States. But it means that there's a lot of really amazing palates around town, right? And so I can take formulas and test batches. Right now I'm working on this Amaro, this wine-based Amaro, and I've been able to sort of shop it around town, sort of get ideas from friends and colleagues that I know. And, winemakers talk to people all the time, right? I mean, all winemakers everywhere have a close net of colleagues that they refer to and they talk to. But I do think one advantage to being in a very urban setting is that my colleagues are oftentimes winemakers, but they're also equally as much craft distillers, craft beer makers, and chefs in restaurants, sommeliers. I mean, if you think about the number of restaurants that are within literally walking distance of my winery, it's huge, right? I mean, I was looking this up earlier today. I'm only 2.8 miles away from Anne's winery, right? Portland Wine Company's the other direction is 2.8 miles. It means that I can do things like I can wander into Canard and go talk to the bar manager at Canard and ask her about what she thinks about doing with an aperitif wine that I might make, right? And that's just a really distinct, interesting advantage of living in an urban setting, which is probably distinct than a rural setting. And it may explain why a bunch of these people, names that we've referenced, right? I know Matt Burson came from the service industry, Jean Groschow came from the service industry. There's just a number of us that sort of came out of that same probably late 90s restaurant milieu that came around in Portland. And I think that kind of has continued on.
Yeah, and I love also a lot of that, not only the sharing of, I guess, palettes, but that sort of shared celebration of fermented beverages. And I was just talking to Lee Medoff, one of the, distillers in, Bull Run Distillery, owner of that, who's downtown Portland, and just how he was, sourcing wine barrels from, wineries, and then also, giving them back to other people, to giving them to brewers. Or so there was just this a lot of I guess cross-pollination of shared resources, but then also, I imagine, I mean, Anne, I know that you're doing cider as well. I imagine there's starting to be some more collaborations between wineries and brewers and wineries and cideries and you know, it's all the fermentation landscape. And you don't have to sort of peg yourself into one specific style or one specific variety because there's so much creativity all around you.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. It's really pretty cool, actually. I know I've done collaborations with a couple of breweries on our cidery side. I've done some cider, some snake bites, some cider beer combos. I made a Manhattan cocktail inspired cider, which was a cherry cider that was aged in bourbon barrels from Freeland Spirits. And then after we spent 2 years aging that cider, the cherry cider, we then emptied those bourbon barrels and then gave them to Westward Whiskey, where they were going to make a specific whiskey aged in the cherry cider barrels as a next generation. So like, talk about round robin, you know, it kind of just really fits in that way. And I've definitely collaborated on some beers that have been aged in different Pinot or Syrah barrels. I know Matt just recently did a Riesling snakebite or Radler style beer with a brewery here. I know I've given some grape must to some breweries in the past that would be part of their brewing. We also made some cider wine hybrids. We co-fermented some ciders with some grape skins and made some rosé ciders that way. We also back sweetened a cider with some Pinot Blanc juice one time. So there's a lot of different collaborations that are happening around the different industries. And Alex, to your point too, and Bree mentioning Lee, my building before it was a winery was a distillery. So talk about really vertically integrating the spirits and alcohol production within Southeast Portland. That's pretty creative and a neat vein of history that goes through it. Also, someone in the chat asked the question of, is there a lot of collaboration between the restaurants and the wineries? And there are. I think it's maybe a little bit less common, but there definitely have been a few wineries that will partner with restaurants and make a small batch wine that would be specifically made for that restaurant as an exclusive product that would be glass poured for that restaurant. So there's a lot of those opportunities, which I do believe kind of probably happens more, or the potential to happen more within an urban center, because like Alex said, we were just, you know, a few blocks away from some of the best restaurants and the best chefs in the country. So, you know, the restaurant closest to my house is Coquine, and Katie Millard has been nominated for a James Beard Award 3 times. So that's, you know, I literally joke with them that I could put my car in neutral and coast down to my house from their restaurant on the hill. So I do think there is a lot more opportunity to partner with a lot of different producers and our chefs and the whole amazing creative food and beverage scene that happens here in Portland.
You know, on that cross-pollination, my interesting sort of connection, I mean, I say that like I have access to like distillers and craft breweries and things like that, but some of them are just very practical. Like so the primary product that I make is this Vin d'Orange aperitif wine, and it has white wine and brandy and like 1,000 pounds of organic Sevilla oranges, and they get steeped in wine and brandy. And what do I do with like 1,000 or more pounds of Sevilla oranges when I'm done with them? Because they don't stay in the final product. So I just like posted on my Instagram feed, does anybody have any suggestions about what I can do with 1,000 pounds of organic Sevilla oranges? And one of my friends at a distillery around, you know, like 2 miles from the winery said, we'll bring them down and we'll just distill them. So then there's this discussion about like, well, let's redistill them and then let's put that back into the final product. We can increase the orange profile that happens on the backside. Some of it's experimentation, but some of it just turns into very practical, like, what could we do with this? And I know that distillery in question, like they do a whole bunch of contract distilling, like months out of the year, do contract distilling for every winery in Oregon, helping them with fortification projects, right? Like contract distilling for small lots that then they can use in port wines or for various fortified wines of some kind. And I think that that's another one of these sort of like intersections of the craft industry within the city, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely one of the most exciting. I know I love going to and seeing what the distillers are doing and what they're playing with, and just having access to all of that fruit, and yeah, orchard fruit as well, knowing that, you know, you're not far from Hood River and all of the cherries and pears and apples, and to your point, and the cideries as well. So yeah, there just seems to be recently there seems to be a lot more of that sort of experimentation happening around town as well. And that was just one of the images of that was the Port and Wine Collective, wasn't it? That tasting room that we had just up there a second ago. That one with Matt again.
That's a Portland Wine Company. Yeah.
Portland Wine Company, that's it. But yeah, there's so much. I love, you know, there's definitely a lot of people watching to happen in Portland, that's for sure. So, you know, to some extent, it's a little bit more entertaining than looking at a, you know, planted vineyard. Depending on what mood you're in.
Someone in the chat asked about the different views, and Julia was great about putting in some suggestions about Instagram. I just want to point out, I'm in my loft right now, which is one of our private tasting spaces, but I'm on a laptop, so I can't flip the screen. But from where I am, I'm literally above the cellar. So, you know, you can, this isn't a vineyard shot, but, you know, I'm literally in my lofted space above my winery, that you could come and have a tasting right here and be literally in the middle of the cellar and see what's going on. And in fact, we do host harvest happy hours where guests could be up here in the loft in the middle of harvest and see the fermentations and actually taste what's happening in the cellar and see the action while being safe in a cozy lounge environment.
That's something you don't get access to very often, for sure.
You know, I think Pam isn't here from Willful Wines, and she wasn't able to attend for a reason. But I know one thing that she wanted to make about all this like panoply of wineries that exist in Portland is like that range of experience, that they go all the way from like really tiny, like loading dock wineries, all the way up to much more traditional wine tasting experience. I mean, I think this is one thing about, for people interested in coming to Portland urban wineries, you can have all sorts of different experiences, all the way from the sort of classic, like let's sit in the barrel room and barrel taste from like the finest vineyards in the state, all the way down to, you know, tiny little wineries that are doing crazy, you know, pet nats and piquettes and carbonic macerations of, you know, co-fermented whites and reds with some cider tossed in. Like it really like runs the whole gamut. And I think that's one of the things that makes the Portland wine making scene so fascinating.
Yeah, it's definitely a fun and good group environment to taste in, because you don't have to, you know, please everyone with the, you know, one grape variety or style. That, you know, you get to experiment all over the place. And that's also one of these, you know, we've got Jackalope, Corey from Jackalopes, you know, white Franc, so Cabernet, you know, white sparkling wine from Cabernet Franc that he makes as well, and, you know, serves in a can. And we're seeing a lot more wine cans showing up in Portland. We know that, you know, Union were one of the first to really begin that here in Portland, but it's really caught on, you know, around the state, and especially in Portland and the Willamette Valley. And also to, you know, to your innovation here with the to-go pouch. I'd never seen that before, and it's such a great idea. You know, having something that you can just throw in your fridge, it isn't going to take up so much space, and also you can have a glass of, and it's not going to oxidize. It's fantastic.
Yeah, that was really a pandemic pivot. Actually, I had no intention of going into alternative packaging in that specific mode, but literally right before COVID hit, I had partnered with a restaurant chain, or not chain, a restaurant group, and had committed the equivalent of about 100 cases worth of wine to keg. And so had kegged up all of this wine for these restaurants that then literally a month later, all of them shut. And so I was sitting on a whole bunch of keg wine and a whole bunch of potential profit, including a very large portion of my rosé, which it was about to be summer. And I panicked, and I was just like, I got to come up with an answer. And I talked to the head of the restaurant group, and I said, look, I think I have an answer. Because I had found these pouches, and they're made from recycled materials. They can be reused. They're also a growler, so you can rinse them and reuse them. I'm really high on sustainability, so I really want to not put more crap into the world. So to be able to reuse something and also have a product that is already made from recycled materials was really cool. But yeah, so I just turned around, found these pouches, ordered a whole boatload of them, and cases of them, and started filling from keg into pouch. And it just so happened that, you know, all of us were turning towards outdoor activities. We were boating, we were hiking, we were, you know, skiing, we were camping. And this like embodies the Northwest outdoors spirit in a really amazing way. And like all the cans and stuff too, the same thing, like this more to go type beverage, because everyone took to the outdoors when the pandemic hit, because, you know, it was safer. You could sort of still be social with people in an outdoor open air environment. And so I think the sustainability, but also just the aspect of the to-go portion of that is less heavy, more easily accessible, more single serving, really did help the alternative packaging take a new turn when the pandemic did hit, because a lot more people were hitting the outdoors and wanted to take a beverage with them. So you did see a lot more cans and pouches and boxes and, you know, single serving type options that existed.
Hey, Anne, I've got to ask, does that pouch right there, does it fit into a hydration pack? And can you hook a straw up to it?
Straw.
Camelback, yeah.
Yeah, right. I think it will fit into an hydration patch, and I'm sure the creative among us could definitely rig that to work. Yeah, easy.
Great idea.
I almost started selling it with the straw, so it could be the adult Capri Sun.
Yeah, it's totally an adult juice pack. Yeah. But sustainable. I love it.
Yep.
It's completely refillable.
That pouch right there is actually a Magnum. That is 2 bottles of wine.
Wow.
Yeah,
2 bottles. Okay.
Yeah.
That is crazy. Well, and I guess, you know, going back to sustainability in Oregon, it's been a sustainable state from, you know, even before there were vines planted here. So, you know, in '66, the governor, you know, enlisted environmental acts to protect, you know, public recreational lands, to protect ag lands from urban development as well. And then also the bottle bill as well, which was passed in '71. So Portlandians or Oregonians, I guess, have always been sort of on that forefront or first foot of the sustainable movement. And I think possibly because we do spend so much time outside, it's so beautiful here, and you know, we're reined in for 6 months of the year, so it's nice to spend as much time outside in the summer when we've got those long sunshine hours when we can, and we definitely tend to protect our environment around us as well. And then I just wanted to hit one more time on the urban landscapes experimentation and diversity, and just how many different styles of wine are being made. Pet nats, piquettes, sparkling wine in cans, those co-fermentations of ciders and wines, and the country wines. Alex and his amazing vermouths and brandies. There's a lot going on here. Alex and Anne, is there anything else that you want to say before we sign off? We're almost at time here, about the PDX urban landscape.
I was trying to think of some of the things that were in the chat. I mean, there was, there's a question in there about our experience with like the OLCC or government agencies. And
Yeah.
I don't think that hasn't been particularly any different. I mean, I do think that like the city development agencies it's an odd question to say like, hey, how do I license my winery in the city of Portland? But we also have lots of other we have some advantages that rural wineries don't. I remember, I used to live in Seattle and I started the process of licensing a winery up there. And someone told me like, well, don't even think about trying to license a winery outside of the city because like wastewater problems are it's become so restrictive, like out in Woodinville trying to license a winery because you can't get rid of wastewater because it all has to, there's no urban wastewater system, right? Whereas in Portland is no big deal, right? Like I have unlimited, I try to use as little water as I can, but we have unlimited clean water and we can dispose of it easily enough. And that hasn't been a problem. And then there's the other advantage, like I think there might be more people in Portland like kegging wine and making these alternative formats because like we're really close to the places where we can deliver it to, right? Like I just started kegging rosé, and I have this great arrangement where I drop the keg off at the restaurant that serves it, and then I go pick it up when they're done, and it's not very far away, so it's very convenient for me. And I know that is common among other people in the Portland scene, right?
Yeah, that accessibility to the restaurant scene is definitely a huge, well, actually, one thing that we haven't really spoken about is that the average cost of a bottle of urban wine is a lot lower than those from some of the other parts of the Willamette Valley. And maybe that also is influenced from having so many restaurants next to you or being in restaurants where you're, very conscious of like BTG, pricing and, why do you think that is? That there's, it seems like a very accessible, price point to get into the wine scene in Portland.
I think one part about it is that it's, at least for me as a startup winemaker, like 3 years ago, I think it's, I was able to sell direct for quite a while because there's just so many outlets to sell to in the city of Portland. I would say that like the small size of most of the wineries and the sort of experimental nature of it makes it, I think all of us are kind of interested in the accessibility of our wine, like not producing things that are, I think the price range goes all the way from like $16 up to $80, right? Like you can buy the most affordable wines and you can buy the highest end, most exclusive, you can buy Shea Vineyard wines and you can buy, like big reds from really select Washington vineyards. So it sort of runs the gamut, but I think that's a reflection of our interest in making wine accessible and making it accessible to like a whole different crowd, whether that's in cans or pouches, but that also is true price ranges, right? And going all the way from the teens up to almost up to triple digits.
I would also, I totally agree with you, Alex, but I would also piggyback on that and just go back to a little bit of what we were saying in the beginning, the fact that, most of us lease our buildings. A few might own them and a few might lease, from other people who own or lease them. So by virtue of that, we don't own a lot of real estate. We own a lot of equipment, but that's not any more than any other winery, any more or less. And so, by virtue of not owning a large plot of land and, paying a mortgage on a whole vineyard and, having an entire team of labor for the vineyard and the winery, I think there is a lower cost that you have if you're only making wine and purchasing grapes than if you own a very large piece of land where you're growing fruit. So, the overhead that we have is a smaller footprint than someone who has an estate vineyard. Obviously everyone has their different, their overhead cash flow situations, but I would say that, the cost of entry for an urban winery, you can skinny that down a little bit because your costs tend to be a little bit lower, especially in a shared setting. So
yeah, you're in a co-op and you're being able to share your machinery costs, your equipment costs as well, and not having the vineyard costs associated with that. Yeah.
I think one thing that we haven't mentioned is that to my knowledge, all of the PDX urban wineries and even beyond the association, every other winery that I know in the city of Portland is independently owned. Right, there are no groups or there are no like structured organizations that own wineries. All the winemakers that I know in Portland, they are the winemaker and they're the owner, and they do all the accounting and they do all of the cleaning and they do everything, right? And this is not. I mean, there are a lot of independent winemakers in Oregon, and you go out to the Valley and you go down to Southern Oregon, and there's a lot, even a vast majority of wine is still made by independent wineries, but 100% of the wine made in Portland is independently made, right? And the chances of going into a winery, into a tasting room and talking to the person who actually runs the forklift is really high, because we're all really small. We're all really small organizations.
Yeah. Along those lines, there's a lot of great questions that are rolling in on the chat right now. One that, are there many growers for purchasing grapes available, or do most of them also make their own wine? There's definitely, well, help me with the stat, Bree, because there's a lot of vineyards out there that do not have a winery, and there are a lot of vineyards that have a winery but also grow excess amounts of grapes that many other wineries purchase.
Yeah, so there's more than 1,400 vineyards, and there's only just scraping 1,000 wineries, and that doesn't include the wineries or wine brands that are owned by the same company but have multiple different brand names. So I would say that the vineyard expansion and planting continues, and I think what we're starting to see is growers who don't want to just sell their fruit to just one company or one winery. There's a lot that want to experiment around and give their fruit to a lot of different people to see what the fruit can be in different hands and with different creative minds behind it. So I think that from even that grower perspective, there's a lot more expansion and creativity happening from a grower perspective as well. Yeah, and in the Willamette Valley alone, there's 700 and something odd wineries and nearly 1,000 vineyards. And often as you move further south as well, you start to get larger vineyard sizes as well, who are selling to not only producers in Southern Oregon, but they're also selling to those in Portland or in the Willamette Valley as well. So there's just a lot of sharing of of fruit and styles across those vineyards as well.
I mean, one of the nice things about being in Portland is it's so accessible to get to different vineyards. And I know Anne and Pam and I had talked about this, about how, we can drive just as easily to McMinnville and out to Carlton or Willamette Valley to those vineyards as we can go out to the gorge, right? Like later this week, I'm going to go check on a vineyard on the Washington side of the Columbia River and go see how they're doing, because they're way high up in elevation. We've had a bunch of snow lately. But that's not any further away to drive to the gorge as it is to drive out to the Willamette Valley. Walla Walla is closer than Southern Oregon is for us. So really, we're sort of at this intersection of all these amazing wine growing, vineyard growing regions, and we can check on all of them, and it's easy to go out and see them and visit those people and have that close relationship.
Yeah, and from a winemaking perspective and experience, it gives you a lot more experience and a lot more creativity to be had working with fruit that comes in at different grape varieties, different brix levels, different ripening levels, and then how they all perform differently in the cellar as well. There's a lot of different decisions that you can make there, and the blending between regions. You're not so reliant on having to have a Willamette Valley AVA or a Umpqua Valley AVA. You can blend across the regions and have an Oregon wine, and if you're purchasing from vineyards all over the state, it's truly an Oregon wine. That's kind of fun.
Yeah, definitely. One other thing that I was just thinking about too, that we've piggybacked on, but honestly, I think being in the urban center, while going through the pandemic might have just saved my brand and allowed me to even remain in business, because I spent the first probably 6 months of the pandemic with a large portion of my time literally dropping off cases of wine on people's front porches, which I kid you not, it felt like it was back to my first year in business when, you know, I just needed to keep selling bottles and boxes. And that was the best use of time, was those direct sales. And, you know, having that many people really come out and wanting to support local and wanting to support women and wanting to support, you know, what was in their backyard. People made a lot of conscious choices about how they were spending their money. And I believe that those folks in the Valley probably didn't have that opportunity as much as those of us did here in the city. And that's obviously a microcosm, and it'll never happen again, knock on wood. But, you know, it was what it was at the time, and it really was a huge help to my business. And honestly, I think for my psyche, to be able to stand 6 feet apart off someone's porch and have a 5-minute conversation about how they're doing and about, you know, the wine and just having human interaction was not only saving my business, but probably my soul a little bit. And that was a very, very big deal.
Yeah, well, it comes back to that community feel and, you know, I guess, you know, the humanity of wine even, you know, it's such a deeply, you know, human beverage from the very start of its production to where it ends up, you know, the entire gamut. There's so many touch points. And so, yeah, I think that where everyone else felt incredibly isolated, it was so good to be able to tap into that community that you had on your doorstep, and super lucky.
Yeah, it was really lucky. It definitely was really lucky. Before I forget, I do want to mention also, for those of you on this call who are local, May is Oregon Wine Month. And in honor of Oregon Wine Month, on May 22nd, the Portland Urban Winery Association is having our first trade tasting in over 4 years, where it's called the PDX Urban Wine Experience, which for one low price, you can come and taste 3 wines from all 13 members of the PDX Urban Wine Association. Also, a portion of the proceeds are going to benefit the nonprofit Join, which is helping our more disadvantaged members of our community here in Portland. So by all means, buy your ticket, come and join us. Tickets are limited, but you will get exactly what we're talking about, a smattering of being able to taste all of these different wines from all of these winemakers in one location.
Awesome, and look forward to it. And yeah, for those of you out there, get out there and support your community, your local community that's in your backyard. Come out and explore. With that, I would like to thank Anne and Alex for joining us, and for Julia and David for being the masters of the chat response. I appreciate that. It's always nice to not have to do it yourself. But really interesting conversation, and I can't wait to get back into Portland and see what you're all up to yet again. And there's always something new to explore. So thank you so much for being part of this. David, I'm going to throw it back to you to give us a wrap up.
Great. Thanks, Bree, and thanks everybody for joining, and the panelists. That was a great webinar with good dialogue, and just really appreciate everybody's time. We're excited that we're about halfway through our Oregon Wine Month educational webinars. Next week, we'll be moving to, I believe, the Rogue Valley, followed by Umpqua, and also taking a look at the Columbia Gorge and Walla Walla regions as the month progresses. Bree's been working hard to make sure that we're coming with great information and additional guests, and really appreciate everybody who's joining and participating in these webinars. So thank you. Information regarding wine and everything else we house on our resource studio. We invite you to go there to pull information and use it for your own promotional materials or for your own education. And the information is right there. Go to the next slide, please.
Slide. There we go.
And here are our contacts. Feel free to email us to reach out if there's anything that you need. And also always sign up for our newsletter that comes out periodically. So with that, I wanted to say thank you for joining us again, and we'll see you guys next week.
Thanks, everyone.
you
Thanks,
so much.
David.
Thanks, everyone.